Britain never lost a single battle on its own soil in the Second World War. And yet, for nearly 4 years, the country came closer to defeat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean than it ever did on any beach or battlefield. Not from invasion, not from bombing, from hunger. Britain is an island. That fact, which had protected it for centuries, was also its single greatest vulnerability. By 1939, roughly 70% of the food Britain ate came from somewhere else. Before the war, the country was importing around 68 million tons of goods a year: food, oil, rubber, steel, timber, the raw material of an entire industrial war economy, almost all of it carried across open ocean in the holds of merchant ships. Take away those ships, and you didn't just take away supplies, you took away Britain's ability to fight at all. Germany understood this before the first shot of the war was fired. Adolf Hitler's navy could never match the Royal Navy battleship for battleship, carrier for carrier, but it didn't need to. If Germany could sink merchant ships faster than Britain could build or import replacements, Britain would be strangled without a single German soldier ever setting foot on English soil. This is the story of why British convoys became the primary target of the German war machine in the Atlantic, and how a campaign fought almost entirely beneath the waves came within a hair's breadth of deciding the outcome of the Second World War. To understand why the convoys were targeted, you have to understand what a convoy actually was, and why Britain built its entire war economy around one. From the very first days of September 1939, Britain organized its merchant shipping into convoys, large groups of cargo vessels sailing together, surrounded by a screen of armed escorts. It was, in essence, the same lesson learned in the First World War. A scattered merchant ship sailing alone was easy prey, but ships bunched together under naval protection were far harder to find, and far harder to sink without cost. Germany's Kriegsmarine had already fought this exact battle once before, 20 years earlier. In the First World War, unrestricted submarine warfare against British shipping had come agonizingly close to succeeding, only to be defeated once convoys were properly organized and America entered the war. Germany's naval planners in the 1930s studied that failure closely. This time, they intended to get it right. The man given the job was Karl Dönitz, a former U-boat commander who had personally experienced the last war's submarine campaign. Dönitz's strategy was built on a brutally simple idea, sometimes called the tonnage war. It didn't matter which ships you sank or what they were carrying. What mattered was the total tonnage of Allied shipping destroyed each month. If German U-boats could sink merchant tonnage faster than British and later American shipyards could replace it, the Allied supply chain would eventually collapse under its own weight, regardless of how many individual battles Britain won. Dönitz calculated that a fleet of roughly 300 ocean-going U-boats, properly deployed, could sink enough shipping to force Britain out of the war entirely. When war broke out in September 1939, he had barely 57 submarines in total, many of them small coastal boats, unsuited to the open Atlantic. Fewer than 30 were capable of extended ocean patrols. The U-boat arm went to war in 1939, without anywhere near the numbers its own commander believed were necessary to win. That shortfall shaped everything that followed. Unable to overwhelm Britain in the war's opening months, Dönitz instead refined the tactics his limited force would use, and convoys, not individual ships, became the deliberate focus of that refinement. Individual U-boats attacking individual ships could only sink so much tonnage before running out of targets, fuel, or torpedoes. Dönitz wanted a way to turn a handful of submarines into a force that could overwhelm an entire convoy at once. The tactic he developed became known chillingly as the Wolf Pack. The idea was straightforward in principle and devastating in execution. A single U-boat, positioned along a known convoy route, would spot an approaching convoy and radio its position, course, and speed back to U-boat headquarters without attacking immediately. That first submarine would then shadow the convoy from a distance, reporting its movements, while headquarters redirected every other available U-boat in the region toward the same location. Once enough submarines had converged, sometimes 6, 8 or more, They would strike together, usually at night, when the convoy's silhouette was visible against a lighter sky, but the low-profile submarines themselves were almost invisible on the dark water. Some U-boat commanders grew bold enough to surface in the middle of a convoy's own columns, firing torpedoes from both bow and stern tubes at point-blank range before diving away into the confusion. A convoy's escort ships were built to hunt down a single attacker. They were far less equipped to deal with half a dozen submarines attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, in darkness, in the middle of a chaotic scene of burning and sinking ships. That was precisely the point. The Wolf Pack didn't need to outfight the Royal Navy's escorts, it needed to overwhelm them. The tactic was first used in September 1940, when a small group of U-boats fell upon a convoy of 42 ships and sank 11 of them. The following month, it happened again with even more devastating results. Convoy SC-7, a slow-moving convoy of 35 merchant ships, escorted by only a handful of warships, was set upon by a pack of U-boats in the North Atlantic. 20 of the 35 ships were sunk. A further convoy, HX-79, was hit almost immediately afterward, losing a dozen more vessels in a single night. German submariners began calling this period, with grim pride, the happy time. Convoys, in other words, weren't targeted because they were an easy option. They were targeted because they represented the single greatest concentration of tonnage the Kriegsmarine could hope to find in the vast, empty expanse of the ocean, and because, once located, a conv could be attacked by multiple submarines working together far more efficiently than by any submarine hunting alone. The fall of France in June 1940 changed the entire shape of the battle before it had properly begun. Prior to that, German U-boats had to sail from bases in northern Germany, around the top of Scotland, and out into the Atlantic, a long and fuel-consuming journey that limited how much time each submarine could actually spend hunting. Once France collapsed, the Kriegsmarine gained direct access to French Atlantic ports, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle. From these bases, U-boats could reach the main convoy routes in a fraction of the time, spend far longer on station, and return home for resupply far more quickly. The result was that a smaller number of U-boats could suddenly maintain a far larger and more persistent presence across the shipping lanes that convoys had no choice but to use. Britain's imports had to cross the Atlantic somewhere, and the available routes were limited by geography, fuel range, and the location of ports on both sides of the ocean. Germany didn't need to search all of the Atlantic. It needed only to concentrate along the corridors convoys were forced to travel. This is also where the vast size of the ocean itself became, paradoxically, an advantage for the attackers rather than the defenders. A single ship sailing alone across millions of square kilometers of open water was almost impossible to find. But a convoy of 40 or 50 ships, moving at a predictable, plodding pace dictated by its slowest vessel, left a far larger and more detectable footprint, and once found, contained a concentration of targets no lone raider could ever hope to encounter by chance. Convoys, then, solved one problem for Britain: safety in numbers, protection through escort, while simultaneously creating the very target profile the Wolf Pack tactic was designed to exploit. Convoys were only as effective as their weakest link, and in the first years of the war, those weak links were numerous. The Royal Navy simply did not have enough escort vessels to protect every convoy along its entire route. Many convoys crossed with only a handful of armed ships, watching over dozens of unarmed merchantmen. Some had almost no protection at all for long stretches of their journey, particularly in the middle of the Atlantic, far beyond the range of land-based aircraft that could otherwise have spotted approaching submarines from the air. This gap became known, grimly, as the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap, a stretch of ocean that patrol aircraft flying from bases in Britain, Iceland, or Newfoundland simply could not reach. Donitz's submarines learned to concentrate precisely in this blind spot, where convoys were most exposed and least likely to be spotted before an attack could be organized. Britain attempted to close these gaps however it could. A 1940 agreement saw 50 Agging American destroyers transferred to the Royal Navy in exchange for busing rights in British territories, providing desperately needed escort vessels at a moment when losses were mounting fast. Canada's Navy grew rapidly to help shoulder the burden of escorting convoys across the western half of the Atlantic. Even so, for much of 1940 and 1941, the balance of the battle favored the attacker. There was also a hidden battle taking place that shaped the entire campaign, the battle over information itself. German naval intelligence, through a code-breaking service known as B-Dienst, was for long stretches able to read British naval signals well enough to help direct U-boats toward convoy routes. Britain, in turn, was working, with growing success as the war progressed, to break Germany's own Enigma-based naval codes, eventually allowing convoys to be rerouted away from known wolf pack concentrations. This invisible contest of code-breaking and interception was every bit as decisive to the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic as any torpedo fired in anger, and it explains why the fortunes of specific convoys could shift so dramatically from one month to the next depending on whose codebreakers currently had the upper hand. By the end of 1941, American involvement in the war was becoming almost inevitable, and when the United States formally entered the conflict in December, Dönitz saw a fresh opportunity rather than a fresh threat. American coastal shipping along the eastern seaboard, in the Caribbean, and in the Gulf of Mexico was, in the war's opening months, almost entirely unprotected. Ships sailed alone, often with their running lights on, silhouetted against the glow of coastal cities that had not yet adopted wartime blackout precautions. German U-boats operating off the American coast found conditions almost identical to a training exercise. Nearly 500 ships were sunk in these waters before the United States finally adopted the convoy system its own ally had been using since 1939. German crews called this second slaughter their second happy time. Sinkings climbed sharply through the first half of 1942, 65 ships in February, 86 in March, 69 in April, well over 100 in May, a rate of destruction that, if sustained, threatened to outpace anything Allied shipyards could replace. It is worth pausing on why this mattered so profoundly to Britain specifically, even though many of these particular sinkings were occurring off American shores. Britain's entire war effort depended on a continuous, uninterrupted flow of tonnage arriving from North America. Fuel, food, aircraft parts, tanks, ammunition, and the raw steel to build more ships all had to cross that ocean. Every vessel sunk anywhere along that supply chain, whether in the mid-Atlantic, the Arctic convoy routes to the Soviet Union, or off the coast of Florida, was tonnage that would never reach a British port, a British factory, or a British soldier. Britain's pre-war imports of 68 million tons a year had, by the depths of this crisis, been cut by more than half. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the entire war, not the blitz, not the threat of invasion, but the quiet, grinding possibility that the country could simply run out of the things it needed to keep fighting. The convoy system that had exposed Britain to the wolf pack was, in the end, also the mechanism through which the Battle of the Atlantic was won, once it was properly resourced. Several developments arrived together in roughly the same window of 1942 and 1943, and their combined weight finally shifted the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. Very long-range aircraft, adapted versions of the American B-24 Liberator bomber, were finally able to close the mid-Atlantic air gap, giving convoys continuous air cover across the entire crossing for the first time. Improved radar allowed escort ships to detect surfaced U-boats at night, stripping away the darkness that wolf-pack tactics depended on. New weapons like the Hedgehog and Squid, forward-firing mortar systems that could strike a submerged submarine without losing sonar contact the way older depth charges required, dramatically increased the lethality of convoy escorts. Dedicated escort carriers brought air cover directly into the mid-ocean gap that land-based aircraft still couldn't fully reach. And continued Allied code-breaking successes meant convoys could increasingly be rerouted around known concentrations of U-boats before a wolf pack ever had the chance to assemble. March 1943 marked, in hindsight, the campaign's most dangerous crescendo. German U-boats sank around 120 merchant ships that month, nearly 700,000 tons of shipping, for the loss of only 15 submarines. The British Admiralty itself later admitted that Germany had never come closer to severing the lifeline between Britain and North America than in the first 20 days of that month. And then, within weeks, everything changed. By May 1943, the combination of long-range air cover, better radar, more escort ships, and superior intelligence allowed convoy escorts to start sinking U-boats faster than German shipyards could replace them, a complete reversal of the tonnage war Dönitz had originally set out to win. Roughly 41 U-boats were lost that single month. Dönitz, recognizing the scale of the defeat, withdrew his submarines from the main convoy routes entirely. Historians still refer to May 1943 as Black May for the German U-boat fleet and as the true turning point of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic never produced the kind of single, decisive clash that history remembers most easily. No Midway, no Trafalgar, no single afternoon that settled the outcome. It was instead the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War, fought from the very first day of the conflict to the very last, in thousands of individual convoy crossings, most of which never made headlines at all. But it was, by any honest measure, one of the most strategically decisive campaigns of the entire war. Every tank that landed in North Africa, every aircraft that flew from an English airfield, every soldier who eventually waded ashore on D-Day depended on a supply chain that had to survive an ocean crossing first. If Dönitz's tonnage war had succeeded, if German U-boats had sunk merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced, there would have been no material for Britain to fight with, no buildup of American forces in the United Kingdom, and quite possibly no invasion of Europe at all. British convoys were targeted in the Atlantic for one simple, brutal reason. They were the most efficient way to destroy the largest possible quantity of the one resource an island nation could not survive without. Germany understood correctly that Britain's greatest strength, its global network of trade and empire, was also its single greatest vulnerability, an artery that could be cut from beneath the waves without ever engaging the formidable surface fleet that guarded it. That the artery held, in the end, was not inevitable. It was the result of a years-long, grinding contest fought largely out of public view, in code-breaking rooms, in aircraft factories, in the freezing wheelhouses of corvettes escorting slow-moving convoys through the dark. The men of the merchant navy who sailed those ships, often unarmed and entirely at the mercy of an enemy they could rarely see, paid the heaviest price of all. History remembers the beaches of Normandy, but everything that made those beaches possible first had to survive a crossing that never stopped for nearly 6 years in the cold and unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic.